wake up in the morning, check the news, and just go, what the f? Hey, what's going on, you guys? Welcome to the Waking News Podcast. My name is Chad Gregerson, and today we're going to be talking about Venezuela. You know, it's a country you probably heard about. It's a country in northern South America that's known for its, largest crude oil reserves in the world, its hyperinflated economy, and its recent, shall we say, forced deportation of its political leader. Because, yeah, it has been a hell of a first week here in the year of 2026. Now, I could have talked about this a few days ago when all the events actually went down, but I actually wanted to just, sit back, relax, and let the situation kind of develop, because a lot of information was coming out, and I just didn't want to be caught in the, hyperbole. I wanted for everything to kind of solidify before I even talked about it. And so I figured today was a good day to finally, just kind of deep dive into it and just essentially talk about it. And the first thing I want to talk about is how we got here in the first place. Now, technically speaking, I could go back decades because there was a lot of, history between Venezuela and the United States, especially concerning their oil reserves. A lot of companies in the past, put a lot of resource and management into this country, but ultimately, due to complications, in souring of relationships, and they have, pulled out over time. In fact, I think only one company in the US still had any investment in Venezuela. But obviously that has changed dramatically over the past year. So we're just going to be focusing on the past year itself. And there's a lot of things that went down that led up to Maduro's. I don't know if I want to call this capture or kidnapping, because it's depending on who you ask. But, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to say his capture, because that is technically correct. He was captured by the US government and brought here, essentially against his will. And I'm not going to say that this man probably doesn't deserve what's coming to him, but it is a very interesting situation and, kind of unprecedented in our time. But let's just go ahead and run down everything that happened over the past year. So technically speaking, everything started back on January 20th, 2025. So basically almost a year ago at this point. So back then, Trump signed an executive order. And remind you, this is actually a few days after he got back into office. So just, for frame of reference. So back on January 20th, Trump signed an executive order that paved the way for criminal organizations and drug cartels to be named foreign terrorist organizations. And this included a Venezuelan street gang called Tren de Agua. And what's really interesting about that development is that U.S. intelligence agencies basically disputed Trump's claim, because they say that, this street gang had no connection with Maduro's administration at all. It had no play in its, drug smuggling operations. And that's actually another big thing about this situation too. It all has to do with the United States, or more specifically the Trump administration, arguing or claiming that Venezuela was part of a massive narco-terrorist organization that was sending drugs into our country. And that's not to say that they weren't doing it, but a lot of people have disputed the fact that, most of its drugs, most of its operation was going off towards Europe. It had very little interest in any operations in the United States. In fact, I think somebody said somewhere that the most of the fentanyl, which is the main drug that's being talked about right here, is actually coming from Mexico, not Venezuela. So why the administration is really focusing on Venezuela? Well, basically it's probably because of the oil, more than likely. But anyway, let's move on. Let's move along to the rest of the timeline. So about a month later, on February 20th, the Trump administration formally designated 8 Latin American crime organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, what's really was interesting about that development is that a terrorist organization is basically reserved for groups that are seeking violence to achieve a political end. But Venezuela was not really focusing on anything on politically, but they were really more focused on, a profit-focused crime, which is, why you sell drugs. You're not doing this for political reasons. You're doing this just for the cash. And obviously Venezuela it's been in dire need of cash for years now, because I think I once read somewhere years ago, due to the massive hyperinflation that the country was suffering, is that I think 80% of its population is in poverty, and very few people can even afford food. Imagine if you're trying to dump $500, American dollars for what you would normally get for 1 week's worth of groceries. And I think that might be a bit of an exaggeration, because I think it's far worse than that. but unfortunately, I'm not an expert in this situation, so you have to go somewhere else for that. But that's just to give you a good idea of just how screwed these people are. And what's really interesting about this whole situation, and I'll get into it, later on, but like a lot of the people in Venezuela are actually cheering this. Like, they actually like what's happening. But because of, how everything has progressed and how everything's developed, a lot of people are very concerned about what happens next because, I served in the army for 5 years. I was in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And to be perfectly honest, what's happening right now is very reminiscent of that. It's like we are apparently are going to be going to run Venezuela, according to President Trump, and we are going to make it, as his words, make it great again. And it just feels like the same thing that we did after 9/11. I realize, of course, this is a completely different situation, but like there are certain, familiar, you know, rhetoric, certain tones that just seem very familiar to me. So I'm just wondering if this is where we're headed. Is this like basically the new Middle East, but now it's like not the Middle East, it's like just tropic South America? So we moved from February 20th to August 19th, and I realize that's a bit of a gap there. But unfortunately, I'm just focusing on some more of the interesting facts that stand out. But on August 19th, the U.S. military deployed 3 guided missile destroyers to the waters off of Venezuela. The naval force in the Caribbean grew within weeks to include 3 amphibious assault ships and other vessels carrying over 6,000 sailors and Marines and a variety of aircraft. They even sent off F-35 fighter jets to Puerto Rico in September, while a Navy submarine carried cruise missiles operated off South America. So basically, for months, they were just building up a military presence in the Caribbean to be ready to respond to any kind of operation that would eventually take place, which, as we all know, went down on the 3rd. And I can't even say that properly because we all know of all the boat strikes that occurred between September 2nd and to the present, because I think the number right now is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 18 boat strikes since September, because the administration claims that all these strikes were against vessels that were basically carrying drugs that were intended to come to the United States. And a lot of politicians have come out basically denouncing these strikes because there's very little evidence to support for this escalation of force. In fact, many people have asked for like any kind of evidence at all, and apparently, according to the Trump administration, there is like video and photographic evidence available, but like it's that they haven't released it. So it's really interesting to see like these kind of operations take place, but like there's nothing to support their validity. And so eventually we moved to November 6th, where the Senate Republicans voted to reject legislation that would have limited Trump's ability to order an attack on Venezuelan soil without congressional authorization. So lawmakers from both parties had demanded more information on the strikes, but Republicans appeared to be willing to give Trump leeway to continue his buildup of naval forces. So this kind of shows you like exactly where the parties are at right now. Basically, Republicans are okay with Trump's, increasing presence in the Caribbean, while the Democrats are trying to limit his, ability to conduct airstrikes because, it just seems like we are just going back to like 2002, 2003, but the roles are kind of like the same. Well, although I do believe that back then there was support for the operation, but now it's just divided straight down party lines, and things are just getting really really effectively crazier by the day. Though thankfully I think things have kind of relaxed a little bit, but I think this is just the call before a massive storm down the horizon. But anyway, so back in going to November 16th, Trump said that the U.S. may be having some discussions with Maduro and Venezuela would like to talk, and that they'll see what happens. So at this point, obviously, there was some sort of negotiation on some level, like something was going to happen. But ultimately, that really doesn't matter because when we moved into December, the U.S. began to seize oil tankers that were coming off the coast of Venezuela that was intended for like other countries, like such as Russia. And basically, this just began effectively a naval blockade to prevent Venezuela from just, selling any oil to anyone at all, which would then, force greater pressure on their country and effectively just bringing, his regime, further and further down, which is kind of amazing the way you think about it, because the whole administration, the whole country of Venezuela has just been suffering for years, and the fact that he was able to stay in power as long as he did was nothing short of like, I'm not gonna call it a miracle, but like it's just insane just how it was even possible because, based off what I understand is that even though he was a president of Venezuela, a lot of people just basically claimed him as a dictator and that he just used whatever power and influence he had to stay in power, and which is why like a lot of people are celebrating in Venezuela right now because they didn't like him. In fact, as I understand it, the operation that took place on January 3rd, basically, he did not have Venezuelan guards. He had Cuban guards because he did not feel safe around his own people. That he actually felt that he had to get outside help to protect him. Which, spoiler alert if you haven't checked the news, didn't really help him that much. I mean, it was like, as I understand it, I think the whole operation took like less than 2 hours. So like, obviously, not the sharpest tools in the shed, but like, it is what it is. So once we get closer to the end of the year on December 30th, the CIA conducted a drone strike on a docking area believed to have been used by the Venezuelan drug cartels. And this kind of continued on for the next few days. And eventually, on the very last day of the year, on December 31st, the U.S. imposed sanctions on 4 companies operating in Venezuela's oil sector and designated 4 additional oil tankers as blocked property as part of a larger shadow fleet that was evading U.S. sanctions in Venezuela. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think just like the other day, there was an oil tanker that was intercepted by the U.S. Navy and the Marines because essentially I think they turned off that transponder, and I think that they were like in the North Atlantic or something. Like it was just insane. Like basically they were trying to avoid this U.S. Navy to like whatever means possible. Now I don't have all the information on that particular event. But, there's definitely reports on it. You can check it out. But it was just, like, crazy how, like, right now, there's, like, these weird, like, shadow games that, various parties in the Atlantic are just playing out because, one would say this is, like, a prelude to, like, much more bigger operations that are coming up. But, I'm not going to sit here and say that because I don't know what's going on in the minds of our government. I used to work for it, of course, but, like, everything changes on like day by day basis. And so I'm not, a legal expert. I don't know how everything should be interpreted, but I'm just basically just talking about like what's happened and my general thoughts on everything. So you guys are gonna have to let me know what you guys think in whatever comment section that this platform has, because I'm trying to get this uploaded to both not just YouTube but also on Spotify as well, because I want to try and make this podcast, a regular weekly thing where I talk about like one specific topic. I think next week, depending on what happens with the next week, of course, I want to talk about the events that happened in Minneapolis I think about 2 days ago, considering the ICE shooting. But we'll save that for next week, unless something else happens. Anyway, so back on the 1st, Maduro held an interview on state television that aired on New Year's Day, basically saying that he was open to negotiation and agreement with the United States to combat drug trafficking. He declined to comment on, however, the CIA-led strike team and reiterated that the U.S. wanted to force government change in Venezuela and gain access to its vast oil reserves. So essentially, Maduro knew something was coming, but like obviously he was trying to avoid it as much as possible. But I guess in the end, the administration decided, yeah, probably not. And so on January 3rd, that's when the U.S. conducted the large-scale strike across Caracas, which is the capital of Venezuela, and captured Maduro and his wife Flores. And like, before I even go any further, I need to know exactly why they chose to also bring the wife, because as I understand it, she doesn't really have any, she wasn't part of the government, at least not that I know of. If I am wrong, I'm wrong, because I just don't see the logic in taking her with him. There has to be a reason behind it. I'm just not aware of it. So if somebody could just educate me on that purpose, that'd be really great. And ultimately, Maduro was taken in the middle of the night and ultimately transported to New York City, where he was held, and he just basically submitted a plea of not guilty to the courts, and so now that's where we're at. And we have to like obviously wait to see how the situation is going to develop in the courts, because obviously it's going to take some time before everything gets set up. Because usually in courts, as you understand it, like you there needs to be a jury of your peers, but like I'm guessing that's not really what's going to happen here, because he has no peers to speak of because they're all on a different continent. So like I'm not really familiar with the legal ramifications of like holding a trial like this. And yeah, obviously I'm not a legal expert by any means, so I'm just very curious to see like how his defense is going to play this, because they can go in many different directions. They, obviously he's not from this country. Like he shouldn't be held responsible for like things he does in his own country, even though I guess technically speaking the stuff that his country was doing to our country was considered illegal, but not really overly destructive, because he wasn't killing people, he wasn't attacking us outright. It was just drugs. But still a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. This is all very terrible, and he definitely deserves like whatever punishment he gets coming to him, because obviously everything that he did to his country and what he was doing towards us was also considerably terrible, and he deserves punishment. But as I said, I have honestly no idea what we can expect from the court going forward, and I really have no idea what to expect from Venezuela either, because since Maduro's capture, Venezuela's vice president was basically named the interim president, and there seems to be some sort of weird like relationship going on between her and the Trump administration. And from what I understand is that Trump is trying to, I guess, from his own words, America may very well control Venezuela for the time being. And what the plan is, according to Trump, is that they're going to like take over the oil production and essentially make sure that the money goes back to Venezuela. But like, you wouldn't go this far unless you were looking for some kind of kickback yourself. So I wouldn't be surprised, if like some of the oil would come to us and it would bring the oil prices down, because as much as I would not like to admit this, I think it's a very accurate assessment. Since Venezuela has both, I think, the largest crude oil reserves on the planet, I think it also has gold too, if I'm not mistaken. Whoever could really control those resources could really be a dominant force in the years to come. So like, right now it looks like that's going to be America. So like, obviously this is going to put America in a much better, foothold going forward. And I just really have no idea how this is all going to play out. And I would really love to know what you guys think. Yeah, but yeah, that's where we're at right now, and we'll just have to wait and see like how the situation develops. And obviously, once we get closer to an actual court date for Maduro, then I'll come back to this topic. But that's where we're going to do it for today's podcast. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next week.